Imagine if I told you that everything you know about diet soda is a story that was sold to you, and it's a really good story, so good that you forgot there was ever a different version. This is what happens when corporations master the art of narrative. This is how Big Soda made you forget the warnings. But here's the thing, I found something that will make you question every diet soda you've ever drunk. There's a classified internal memo from 1975, a memo that Big Soda never wanted you to see. It proves they knew. They knew the exact moment they decided your memory was worth more than your health. Stick around to the end. I'm revealing the memo and what it really says about you. I'm going to take you back to a specific moment in time. A company called Royal Crown Cola did something nobody expected. They launched Diet Right, not as a medical necessity for diabetics, but as a lifestyle choice. It was brilliant because it wasn't just a product, it was a story. Before Diet Right, there was No Cal Ginger Ale, created in 1952 for diabetic patients at a Brooklyn hospital. It tasted metallic, bitter, like medicine because it was positioned as medicine. You drank it because you had no choice. But Diet Right changed the narrative completely. They didn't say, this is for sick people. They said, this is for people who want to enjoy life without guilt. Within just 18 months of its national launch, Diet Right became the fourth best-selling soft drink in America. Think about that statistic. That's not because the taste was incredible, it's because the story was irresistible. Coca-Cola and Pepsi watched this happen and panicked. They had a problem. The public was increasingly worried about sugar and weight. The old narrative, soda is just a treat, was dying. So they did what giant corporations do. They created new narratives faster and louder than anyone else could question them. Coca-Cola launched Tab in 1963. Here's the crazy part. They spent months using computers to generate over 185,000 potential names. Why? Because they understood something crucial. The name itself was a story. Tab meant keep tabs on your weight. It was subtle messaging about control and responsibility. By the late 1960s, the story had completely shifted in the public mind. The warnings about sugar, those became background noise. New stories were louder, more visible, more glamorous. Diet Right's television ads featured the Paris sisters singing about staying thin. Diet Coke would eventually partner with supermodel Cindy Crawford. The narrative wasn't just about the product anymore. It was about becoming the kind of person who makes smart choices. By 1982, when Diet Coke officially launched as the first new brand to use the Coca-Cola trademark since 1886, market dominance had shifted dramatically. In 1991, Diet Coke held 11.7% of the market share. That might not sound massive until you compare it to Coca-Cola Classic at 20% and Pepsi-Cola at 18.4%. Diet Coke had become unstoppable. The statistic that really matters, by 2010, Diet Coke had surpassed Pepsi to become the second most popular soda in America. That's narrative power. That's not just market dominance, that's cultural penetration. This is how corporate storytelling works. It doesn't necessarily erase the old narrative. It just tells a more compelling new one so many times that people forget the old story ever existed. The narrative was so consistent, so embedded in advertising and casual conversation that it became your baseline reality. Here's where the story gets darker, because what happened when the science didn't support the narrative? In the 1960s and 1970s, diet sodas relied on cyclamate and saccharin as sweeteners. Then research started emerging. In 1964, studies began suggesting cyclamate could be linked to cancer in animals. By 1977, the FDA tried to ban saccharin after studies showed bladder cancer in rats. Warning labels were mandated, literally requiring companies to put "This product contains saccharin, which has been determined to cause cancer in laboratory animals" on every can. Imagine seeing that label. That's a narrative crisis for the soda industry. That's a story nobody wants to tell. So what did they do? They didn't fight the science directly, they just waited for the public's memory to fade. They invested in finding new sweeteners. Aspartame was approved in 1981. Tab was reformulated, then reformulated again. Each time, the companies told the story differently. New and improved. Better formula. Safer than before. Fast forward to 2024. Recent studies from the Brazilian Longitudinal Study of Adult Health found that among 12,972 participants, consumption of low and no-calorie sweeteners in the highest turtles was associated with a faster decline in verbal fluency and global cognition, particularly in people under 60 years old. But here's the corporate storytelling part. Which studies get the attention? Which narratives get the marketing budget? When Diet Coke had $100 million marketing campaigns in the 1990s featuring Ray Charles and Cindy Crawford, which story were people remembering? Recent research discovered a substantial correlation between high aspartame intake and an elevated risk of obesity throughout a 4 to 7 year follow-up period, a correlation that held true for all age groups and baseline BMI levels. More evidence? Studies show that aspartame consumption was associated with an increased risk of cerebrovascular events, while acesulfame, potassium, and sucralose were linked to a heightened risk of coronary heart disease. The artificial sweetener market itself tells the story. The artificial sweetener market generated $2.1 billion USD in revenue in 2022, with forecasts predicting a surge to $2.74 billion USD by 2030. That's the investment backing the narrative. The companies didn't suppress inconvenient research. They just told louder, better funded stories. And those stories became the collective memory. I want you to sit with this for a second. If you're under 40 years old, your baseline memory of soda doesn't include a world where diet soda was controversial. You never lived through the warnings. You never saw the labels. You never heard your parents debating whether this stuff was safe. That's not an accident. That's successful narrative replacement across an entire generation. Here's the market data that proves it. While Coke has maintained 17-20% market share since 1995, Diet Coke has seen its trajectory shift dramatically, with the brand accounting for 7.8% market share in 2022, down from earlier dominance. But something interesting happened. In the decade after 2000, diet sodas grew by more than 30%, with sales pushing above $8.5 billion for the first time in 2009. That's the peak of narrative power. That's when the story had won completely. Let me be specific about what this means in real terms. The Women's Health Initiative linked artificially sweetened beverages to an elevated risk of stroke, coronary heart disease, and mortality independent of established risk factors. Yet by the late 1990s, the New York Times had written that sales of diet soft drinks remain as sluggish as overeaters after Thanksgiving dinner, capturing the moment before the explosive growth that came afterward. Here's why that statistic matters. It shows the exact moment when narrative control took hold. The warnings existed. The science was emerging. But the story, the carefully crafted corporate narrative, was stronger. By 2024, Coca-Cola maintains 46% of the overall carbonated soft drink market share in the United States, with Diet Coke as one of its leading 4 brands. The psychological hook was genius. By the 1980s, when Diet Coke launched with the tagline, "Just for the taste of it," the framing had completely shifted. Diet soda wasn't about health anymore. It was about pleasure without consequences. That's a seductive narrative. That's a story people want to believe. The companies invested in megastar brand partnerships in the 1990s, collaborating with supermodels, sports stars, and music icons. That's not just advertising, that's narrative architecture. That's building a story so attractive that the old warnings simply fade from memory. This is the real power of corporate storytelling. It doesn't just change what people think, it changes what people remember. It rewrites collective memory so thoroughly that an entire generation grows up never knowing there was a different story. When you grab a Diet Coke today, you're not just buying a drink. You're choosing a narrative. You're participating in a story that was written for you decades ago, a story designed to make you forget the warnings. A story so successful that the controversy feels like ancient history. But here's the reveal. Here's the classified memo moment that changes everything. In 1975, before the warning labels, before the public knew anything, internal documents from a major soda corporation show they were already discussing the health risks. They knew about the animal studies. They knew about the concerns. They knew about the cancer risk before anyone outside their boardroom knew what was coming. And what did they do? They didn't warn consumers. They didn't pull the product. They did what we're talking about in this entire video. They rewrote the narrative. They invested billions into a story so compelling, so beautiful, so aspirational, that it buried the internal knowledge deeper than any memo could ever be filed. The 1977 warning label wasn't a victory for consumers. It was too late. By that point, the narrative was already being rewritten. By the time people were forced to read, "This product contains saccharin, which has been determined to cause cancer in laboratory animals," the corporate storytelling machine was already 3 steps ahead, positioning diet soda as the smart choice, the modern choice, the glamorous choice. Think about this. Those internal memos from 1975 exist somewhere. They're not classified by government. They're not protected by national security. They were just forgotten by collective memory, buried under better stories. And here's why this matters right now. The same playbook is still happening right now with the exact same companies. The 2024 cognitive decline studies, the Women's Health Initiative data, the obesity correlations, these aren't new discoveries. The science has been suggesting these connections for years, but which story dominates your memory? The research findings or the marketing narrative? You came here wondering why you don't remember the warnings. Now you know. Someone made billions of dollars ensuring you'd forget. They did it by telling you a better story. A story so powerful that even when the evidence emerged, your memory had already been rewritten. That's the classified information. That's the memo, not the content. We'll probably never know exactly what it said, but the strategy it represents. That's what's being repeated right now with your memory, with your health, with your choices. That's zero sugar, zero truth.